When you think about it, chemicals are a big part of everyday life, both at home and in the workplace. We all use cleaners, detergents, solvents, pesticides, and many other chemicals on a daily basis. We put gasoline and oil in our vehicles, and sunscreen on our skin. Chemicals are present in cosmetics, shampoo, and even in some of the food we eat. In short, in today's society, you can't completely avoid chemicals. Many people make their living handling, using, and manufacturing chemicals. The purpose of any hazard communication program is to make you more aware of chemicals, their properties, and their potential hazards. It is of critical importance that you know how to properly use, handle, store, clean up, and dispose of chemicals. This video is only the first step. Your employer will provide additional training and information specific to your job and location. The goal is a safe and healthy workplace. This can only happen if employees, management, and suppliers work together in applying the basic concepts covered in this program. Remember, the safe way is the only way to work. It has been estimated that more than 32 million workers utilize up to 650,000 hazardous chemical products in more than 3 million American workplaces. This is why the following information is so vitally important to learn and put into practice. Again, the basic goal of a hazard communication program is to be sure employers and employees know about work hazards and how to protect themselves, which will help to reduce the incidence of chemical source illness and injuries. Chemicals can pose a wide range of health hazards, such as irritation, sensitization, and carcinogenicity, and physical hazards such as flammability, corrosion, and reactivity. OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard is designed to ensure that information about these hazards and associated protective measures is made available to both employers and employees. Employers with hazardous chemicals in their workplaces prepare and implement written hazard communication programs. The goal is to ensure that all containers are labeled, employees are provided access to MSDS sheets, and an effective training program is conducted for all potentially exposed employees. When employees have this information, they can effectively participate in their employer's protective programs and take steps to protect themselves. In addition, the standard gives employers the information they need to design and implement an effective protective program for employees potentially exposed to hazardous chemicals. By working together, these actions will result in a reduction of chemical illnesses and injuries in workplaces. Proper labeling is an extremely important component of any hazard communications program. In-plant containers of hazardous chemicals must be labeled, tagged, or marked with the identity of the material and appropriate hazard warnings. Chemical manufacturers, importers, and distributors are required to ensure that every container of hazardous chemicals they ship is appropriately labeled with such information and with the name and address of the producer or other responsible party. Employers purchasing chemicals can rely on these labels provided by their suppliers. If the material is subsequently transferred by someone from a labeled container to another container, that person will have to label that container clearly to prevent an unintentional exposure. The primary information to be obtained from an OSHA-required label is an identity for the material and appropriate hazard warnings. The identity used by the supplier may be a common trade name, such as Black Magic Formula, or a chemical name, such as trichloroethane. The hazard warning is a brief statement of the hazardous effects of the chemical, such as flammable or causes lung damage. Labels frequently contain other information, such as precautionary measures like "do not use near open flame." But this information is provided voluntarily and not necessarily required. Labels must be legible and prominently displayed. There are no specific requirements for size or color or any specified text, so read all labels carefully. If you have any questions, ask your manager immediately. They are there to help you be safe and successful in your job. As we mentioned, chemical manufacturers and importers are required to obtain or develop a material safety data sheet for each hazardous chemical they produce or import. Distributors are responsible for ensuring that their customers are provided copies of these MSDSs. Employers keep on file an MSDS for each chemical they use, and may rely on this and other information received from their suppliers. There is no specified format for the MSDS under the rule, although there are specific information requirements. OSHA has developed a non-mandatory format, OSHA Form 174, which may be used by chemical manufacturers and importers to comply with the rule. The MSDS sheets are required to be in English. If you do not receive an MSDS from your supplier automatically, your management will request one for you. The role of MSDSs is to provide detailed information on each hazardous chemical, including its potential hazardous effects, its physical and chemical characteristics, and recommendations for appropriate protective measures. This information is useful for both employees and employers. If you are not familiar with the material safety data sheet and with chemical terminology, ask your supervisor for assistance. Let's take a look at a typical MSDS sheet. Section 1 is Product Identification. This includes the name of the manufacturer and identifies the chemical and trade names of the substance. Section 2 lists the hazardous ingredients, including hazardous mixtures of liquids, solids, or gases. This section also lists any carcinogenic or cancer-causing components, if any are contained in the chemical. Section 3 explains the physical characteristics of the substance. This section gives engineering and management information on flash points, solubility rate, evaporation rate, and other physical characteristics to help determine how to use the chemical safely. Section 4 deals with fire and explosion hazards and extinguishing fires containing this chemical. It's always a good idea to notify your local fire department if you use chemicals requiring special firefighting techniques or equipment. Section 5 contains reactivity information, such as what chemicals, liquids, or substances may react to this particular chemical. Section 6 contains procedures for spills and leaks. You can't just wash spilled chemicals down the drain or mop them up and throw the residue in the trash. Each chemical has specific procedures that must be carefully followed. This information is also used to prepare emergency action plans. Section 7 is extremely important as it explains potential health hazards. You need to know if the substance is harmful, then take the required precautions to reduce exposure. Section 7 also explains emergency first aid and emergency procedures. Section 8 explains the type of protective equipment or engineering controls required to reduce exposure. It may specify safety glasses, gloves, respirators, ventilation equipment, or other hygiene procedures. Although these sections may be different on your material safety data sheet, all the information will be contained on the sheet. Material safety data sheets must contain this information, although the forms used may be slightly different from manufacturer to manufacturer. It's your right to know, and the information is available. All you have to do is ask your supervisor. Keep in mind that most MSDS sheets are written for the bulk user as opposed to the tabletop user, but the majority of the end users are using small quantities of the chemical. An example would be the use of isopropyl alcohol. Most users, whether in an electronics company or medical facility, are using this flammable and toxic material in small quantities, but the MSDS is written for the tank car or even 50-gallon drum user level. The sheet may read, if a spill occurs, use self-contained breathing apparatus. Evacuate all personnel. This would be the proper procedure for a large spill, but not for a few ounces spilled on a countertop. Employees need to realize that the MSDS sheets may have some weaknesses in quantity hazard index identification. Again, ask your supervisor for additional information as required. Each employee who may be exposed to hazardous chemicals when working will be provided information and training by the company prior to initial assignment to work with a hazardous chemical or whenever the hazard changes. Exposure or exposed means that an employee is subjected to a hazardous chemical in the course of employment through any route of entry, such as inhalation, ingestion, skin contact, or absorption, and includes potential accidental exposure. Information and training is a critical part of the hazard communication program. Information regarding hazards and protective measures are provided to you through written labels and material safety data sheets. However, through effective training, you will learn to read and understand such information, determine how it can be obtained and used in the workplace, and understand the risks of exposure to the chemicals in the workplace, as well as ways to protect yourself. Keep in mind that the underlying purpose of the Hazard Communication Standard is to reduce the incidence of chemical source illnesses and injuries. This will be accomplished by modifying behavior through the provision of hazard information and information about protective measures. If everyone participates, there will be a better understanding of the chemical hazards within the workplace. Chemicals in today's society and workplaces are here to stay, and many chemicals are extremely safe to use, but all chemicals must be treated with respect, and you must always follow the manufacturer's recommendations and instructions. Also, never mix any chemicals unless you have been trained and authorized by management. Mixing chemicals can be extremely dangerous. Even at home, improper mixing of chemicals can be extremely hazardous. If you mix a common household chlorine cleaner with ammonia, it can form a deadly gas called chloramine. Of course, never wash or pour spilled chemicals down the drain. Always follow your company's spill cleanup and disposal procedures.
The Hazard Communication Standard is now aligned with the globally harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, or GHS. This update to the Hazard Communication Standard will provide a common and coherent approach to classifying chemicals and communicating hazard information on labels and safety data sheets. In order to ensure chemical safety in the workplace, information about the identities and hazards of the chemicals must be available and understandable to workers. OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard, HCS, requires the development and dissemination of such information. Chemical manufacturers and importers are required to evaluate the hazards of the chemicals they produce or import and prepare labels and safety data sheets to convey the hazard information to their own downstream customers. All employers with hazardous chemicals in their workplaces must have labels and safety data sheets for their exposed workers and train them to handle the chemicals appropriately. Hazard classification provides specific criteria for classification of health and physical hazards as well as classification of mixtures. Labels. Chemical manufacturers and importers will be required to provide a label that includes a harmonized signal word, pictogram, and hazard statement for each hazard class and category. Precautionary statements must also be provided. Safety data sheets. Safety data sheets will now have a specified 16-section format. Certain chemicals, due to their physical properties, exhibit physical hazards, including flammability, reactivity, and other properties. Physical hazard chemicals fall in the following classes: flammable liquids, or solids, combustible liquids, explosives, organic peroxide, oxidizers, pyrophoric materials. These are materials that may ignite spontaneously in air at temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Health hazard chemicals are those that may cause acute or chronic health effects after exposure. It can be an obvious effect, such as immediate death from inhaling a deadly chemical. A health hazard may not necessarily cause immediate or obvious harm to you or even make you sick. In fact, you may not see, feel, or smell the danger. An acute health effect usually occurs rapidly following a brief exposure. A chronic health effect is long, continuous, and follows repeated long-term exposure. As an example of what kinds of chemicals cause health hazards, the list includes carcinogens or cancer-causing chemicals. An example could be formaldehyde or benzene. Toxic agents could include lawn or garden insecticides. Irritants may include chemicals such as ammonia or bleach. Corrosives are caustic sodas or battery acid. That's not the entire list, but it provides an idea of different types and kinds of chemicals. Containers of hazardous chemicals must be labeled in English. Generally, where there are non-English-speaking personnel, the label should be in that language or languages also. Labels must contain the following information: identity of the hazardous chemical, appropriate hazard warning, name and address of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. You may use signs, placards, symbols, batch tickets, or printed operating procedures in place of labels on individual containers, as long as the meaning is fully understood by the people using the chemicals. There are several systems and standards for labeling chemicals, but there is not a uniformly accepted system to date. Each system and standard has advantages and limitations. The NFPA Diamond is used primarily by emergency response personnel and does not adequately signal occupational hazards. The NFPA system is good for alerting personnel and the degree of hazard of the chemical and is helpful in drawing attention to storage needs and emergency equipment requirements. HMIS, or Hazardous Material Information System, is one of the most popular systems for labeling containers. It uses standard labels to communicate hazards through the use of colors, numbers, and letters of the alphabet and symbols. The new labeling system under the GHS program will have distinctive labels and pictograms to help you identify the chemical's hazards. If you're experienced, you should know quite a bit about MSDS, or Material Safety Data Sheets. MSDSs are factual information sheets that relate to chemicals. The manufacturer is required to provide the required information, and each employer is required to maintain these MSDS on file. Anyone who uses the chemical may then ask to see the MSDS to determine information that may not be provided on the labels. The employer may have all the MSDS information on an electronic database. The primary requirement is the MSDS must be readily accessible. The major difference between material safety data sheets and the new safety data sheets is the SDS, or safety data sheets, have a 16-section format. The information will be more standardized as well. The new GHS, or Global Harmonizing System, is more standardized in its labeling requirements, and the SDS and its 16-section format will add more information on each chemical. Because this is a transition from MSDS to SDS, you'll continue using the old MSDS, and you may see the new SDS from time to time. Eventually, everything will be smoothly transitioned to the new labels, classifications, and, of course, the safety data sheets. Most of the elements of the Hazard Communication Standard are retained, with some updating to the new GHS.